Hi, this is Mark Arnold with another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. And today I have new special guest brought to us by Kamden Spies, who's a returning guest. And his name is Rob Stolzer. How are you? And how are you?
I am
Good.
doing well. Thank you, Mark.
So, Camden brought you with us today, Rob. And basically, what I know about you is you're an artist, you're a writer, you're a teacher, and a big fan of comic strips and animation, things like that. And so we're probably going to talk a little about everything and anything. It's all kind of a free form. So
Sure.
I guess basically you could start us off by just ask. We'll ask, how did you get interested in animation and comic strips? And take it from there.
Rob's real specialty though is comic strips and really comic
Okay.
strips, editorial comics, not really animation as much.
Okay. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, I will say, early on, Stu Reesboard, who used to run Cartoon Carnival in Pennsylvania, tried to get me involved in animation, but I've just found over the years it's much easier for me if I just have fewer things to focus on. So comic strips, humorous illustration, British cartoons, British illustrations. I'm covering from the 1860s to present. That's enough for me.
Okay.
I don't need to start
All right.
delving into lots of other things. Yeah.
I'm the opposite, where I'm just interested in a lot.
Well, yeah, and I will say I started off that way, and I think as I got older, I started to sort of fine tune my vision
Yeah.
Mhm.
into things, and I tend to have pretty eclectic tastes in things, coming from the arts, coming from university teaching. I straddle the fine art world, the comic art world, and so I try to look at things through whatever weird lens I like to see things in. I don't follow the mainstream things, and just kind of I write about what I love. I try to shine a light on artists who are kind of lost to time, who have fallen through the cracks, and just I've always had that love and continue to have that love. But if you want some background, I mean, I got involved in this stuff through comic books. In the mid 70s, late 70s, I grew up in New Jersey. We had the Fans of Central Jersey. It was a comic book club in Central Jersey. Did small comic book conventions, newsletters, all that stuff. Started going to comic conventions in the 70s, and just seeing the artists draw was real eye-opening to me. Going to some of the early creation cons, 1977, 78. I mean, I remember meeting John Byrne back there, way before X-Men stuff, and just seeing him draw was like magic to me. And that really got me pretty involved in just sort of the art part of the art world. I wish I had the sketches that I got back then, because those $20 sketches are worth many times that today. And through that, my parents at one point gave me a copy of the great comic Chicago of the Chicago Tribune, New York Daily News by Herb Galewitz. Galewitz produced some pretty crappy books, but he was the only one who was doing reprint books like that at the time. Did Bringing Up Father, did the great comics of the Tribune, Chicago Tribune,
Was Bill
New York
Blackbeard
Daily
doing his
News.
stuff yet?
I think that was around the time Blackbeard was
Yeah.
was doing like the big Smithsonian books. They would have been around that time. And Bill's book, I mean, that was also really eye opening as well. I've got up on my wall over here, you can't see Wash Tubbs Daily Strip that was in Bill's book. That whole whaling sequence that he did of Roy Crane's Wash Tubbs was just, it blew my mind, because that wasn't stuff I knew. I mean, I grew up with Peanuts and Louie and Beetle Bailey, and more of the humor strips. I didn't really know anything about the adventure stuff. So those books really introduced me to, Dick Tracy, Terry and the Pirates, Gasoline Alley, all that kind of stuff. And I was hooked. I mean, I joke with my mother, that was my gateway drug
Yeah.
into comic strips. And I've
I
never
always
left
tell
that.
people that my gateway drug into what I like was Brian Walker's book, because I got
Hmm.
two books at a Borders bookstore the same day. I
Yep.
was literally, not joking, hands and knees, begging my parents to get two books. Brian Walker's book of the comics, the complete collection, as well as Jerry Beck's book, they had a Rivera story.
Yep.
And both books I remember opening up, and I remember seeing, discovering Peanuts, and I remember I had familiar with like 5 different comic strips, but I remember discovering Crazy Cat and Pogo, strips that I would understand later when I grew up a little older too.
Right. Well, I don't know if I still don't know if I understand Crazy Cat. Crazy Cat is my favorite strip of all
Yeah.
time, I would say. But understanding it, it's one of those strips I don't feel like I need to understand
My
to appreciate
favorite,
it.
my favorite. By the way, I wanted to tell you, I never got to tell you my favorite Crazy. I discovered my favorite Crazy Cat storyline the other day. I was reading something, and I was reading because I'm a big silent movie buff, and I bought those Fantagraphics books. I've been buying the newer editions of the Crazy Knickknacks that they've been publishing recently, which I hope they come out with the next one soon. But Harold Lloyd, there was a Harold Lloyd storyline, and I love it.
Yeah, he did. He touched on Chaplin at some point,
Yeah,
Lloyd.
he reviewed the Gold Rush.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah, that's right. Yes. I mean, he would get into some pop culture stuff
Yeah,
throughout the strip.
I love that Harold Lloyd storyline though, where Crazy dresses up as Harold Lloyd.
Yeah.
So you had a question, Camden, right before we started. I guess ask it again.
Yeah, I have a question about your websites because
Yeah.
Yeah.
you run a lot of different websites. In fact, when I was
Yes.
searching for Mark, there were a couple of websites I'd never even heard of because I knew you ran the Mr. Oswald website.
Yep.
I did not know you ran the Greg Duncan website.
Right.
That was new to me until today.
Yeah. And Duncan,
If you could, I was just wondering, could you like give us an effort, in essence, of who these artists were because these are more.
yeah, and yeah, I will give you a quick rundown. So early in my collecting, I grew up a Sad Sack comic book fan. The earliest comic I remember buying was a Sad Sack comic, and somewhere I've got the number and the issue because I'd love to find the cover art to it at some point. But
Mark might be able to help you since he wrote the book on Harvey Comics.
well, no, I know. I mean, I know which issue it is. I'd like to find the cover, the original art though.
It's a George Baker one, right? It's not
It's a George Baker cover,
yeah,
and
okay.
I love Baker's late stuff. It's just so Bigfoot, goofy kind
Yeah.
of stuff. But my father bought me that comic on the way to. He worked in New York, and I went with him one day. So at the train station going to New York, he bought me the comic. And so I knew of Baker when I bought some of the first the collections of Sad Sack from World War II, the ones that appeared in Yank magazine. And in the back of the first volume is a portrait of Baker by Gregor Duncan, and that was my introduction to Gregor Duncan. It's a really beautiful pen and ink portrait of Duncan. And so many years ago on eBay, I had picked up some World War II pieces that Duncan did. He did when he joined the Army Air Force. He did publicity work, I think in Colorado, I believe, and did some like training sort of illustrations. And I'd never heard. I mean, I heard of him only through the Sad Sack book. And so I started just doing a little bit of research. That's it. There's George Baker by Gregor Duncan. And so I started doing some research, and I ran across
what is that book, Mark?
What? This is called Sad Sack. My desk jacket's ripped, unfortunately, but it's
there were 2 volumes of that. So that's the first.
This is the first one. I have the second one over there, but
yeah, they're wonderful books.
Yeah.
But in doing some research, I ran across an archive in Nevada, part of which featured an oral history by Duncan's widow, Janice Goodhue. And so, I'm looking around because as a researcher, you gotta follow any dead ends. I had no hopes that she would be alive because she would have been in her 90s. So I start, looking in Nevada. Sure enough, she was alive in Reno, Nevada. And I wrote her a letter, and I just said, I'd love to do an article about your husband. Would there be a chance to, I wrote questions to her. Well, she called me up. Long story short, my son and I always did a lot of road trips out to the Southwest from when he was very little. And so on one of these road trips, we detoured to Reno. I met her, interviewed her. I think she was 95 or 96 at the time, and telling me stories about, after her husband was killed in World War II, Bill Malden consoled her and gave her this big, beautiful drawing that she donated to a family friend at some point. But she was also overseas because she worked for the Office of like Wartime Information, OWI, something like that. Um, and so that became the basis for the article that appeared in Hogan's Alley, the Gregor Duncan article. Probably the first thing written about him since any obituaries, appeared in print after he died. And he had an incredible life. I mean, he was there during early labor movements in San Francisco and New York. He was there at Cafe Society in New York, the first interracial club in New York, where Billie Holiday introduced Strange Fruit, and Zero Mostel was the first MC of that club. He did a mural on their wall and received like a $75 credit that Janice said they never used that entirely because this is the 30s. $75 went a long way in the 30s. And he also, besides, he did a lot. I think he illustrated 10 books. Worked for PM newspaper, worked in a lot of publications. Judge. He worked in Whiz Comics 1 through 10,
Oh,
doing oh, was it Golden Arrow? Might
Yeah,
have been the
Golden
Golden
Arrow.
yeah.
Arrow. Yeah, he did. He worked on 3 features. And I know, I talked to Steranko at one point about him because Steranko had talked to an editor who worked at Fawcett at that time, who spoke highly of Duncan. But it gets kind of confusing because I think that he's credited as Greg Duncan for Wiz. And
Hmm.
so people don't make that connection of Gregor Duncan and Greg Duncan. And he also worked for like the Daily Worker under a pseudonym. He took his part of his mother's maiden name. His uncle was Maynard Dixon, the very famous Western painter. And so I think he became like Greg Dixon or something for the Daily Worker. I was never able to find any of those published cartoons though. But, once I had all the information, it seemed silly not to do anything with it. And so, I talked to the family and I just said, do you mind if I put this together? And, I haven't done much with it since I got it started. I mean, I'd like to, now that I'm retired, I'd like to be able to, do some blog posts now and again just to keep it active. Same with the Mr. Oswald site. But that was really the basis for it. I mean, that Sad Sack is the cause of my Gregor Duncan interest. You just never know where these threads are going to go. I mean,
Right.
and I don't close any doors on any of this stuff. You mentioned the Mr. Oswald site. I mean, I interviewed Russ in 1995. I wrote him a letter because I found out where he was in Gibson City, Illinois. He wrote me back and said, call me up and we'll set something up. Well, the guy was 101 years old. And so I didn't procrastinate. I set something up with him that summer. And he died 2 months after the interview. So
Mm.
I got the last interview with him. And, we're just talking, and this is 95. But at some point it dawned on me, he's regaling me with stories. He worked with Billy DeBeck in Chicago, but he was a World War I vet. And do the math, even from 1995, from 1918, there weren't too many World War I vets still around. And he joined the Navy because he loved the Katzenjammer kids. I mean,
Mhm.
so there were all these sort of comic strip connections that went on in there. So I've been lucky to be able to do some interesting interviews, to meet some interesting people through the interviews. Like I said, I tend to gravitate towards artists who I like, whether they're popular or not. And part of the joy of it for me is to, shine a light on them. But I also like the reason why I gravitate more towards comic strips rather than comic books is it's easier for me to create like a social context. Because comic strips are very timely. You read Little Orphan Annie during the 30s, and you're going to learn about the Depression era, and you're going to learn about Hoover tent cities, or you read Dennis
Barney
Workman's
Google during the war.
yeah, Barney Google during the war, Moby Dick and the Duke during the 40s in the Hooverville cities. And there's something about that that I just find really fascinating, and I really like to, present the context of it. So, when I did the piece on Jay Irving, who drew Potsy, and he also drew Willie Doodle. He drew two cop strips. Well, his son is Clifford Irving, the famous author who wrote they did the movie The Hoax about him, starring Richard Gere, because he wrote that phony autobiography of Howard Hughes. And
Oh,
so, I wanted to
didn't know that.
interview him because this is his father, and this is right around the time The Hoax came out.
Right.
So, a friend of mine, his wife at the time, who was an author, they shared the same agent. And so they sent me Clifford Irving's phone number. And so it's like, okay, I'll call Clifford Irving up. And he was very cagey because, again, it's right when the movie came out. And I said, I'd like to talk to you about your father and his cartoon. And he just got really expansive all of a sudden. He was like, oh, great. No, you don't want to talk to me about the movie. So, again, on one of the trips, we went through Colorado and stopped in at his home. And I got to chat with him for a couple of hours and interview him about his father. And it was fascinating because he was diametrically opposed to his father's views about cops. His father worshipped them. He had an uncle who was a strike breaker, who would ride on horseback through crowds and break people's skulls open with his baton. And Cliff wasn't anything like that. He didn't trust cops, didn't like him. So I found it really fascinating, that his father did these comic strips about cops and his son didn't care for him. Right here, we'll have dueling cats. There we go.
Yeah. This is actually a dog. This is a
Oh,
dog.
no, okay, I can tell.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, my dogs won't fit on my lap. They're
She,
130
she,
pounds each. So,
yeah. She's a camera whore. She loves to be on camera when I do these podcasts. So you'll eventually see
excellent.
her. It's Mia
Yep.
is her name. Anyway, on your websites, you have
Yep.
at least those two that are about artists.
Yep.
Are you considering like a third one? And I'll just hold this up. I know you
Oh,
Or
like
I
is
pictures,
there
have,
a
but
third one and we're missing it?
I have 5 websites. I
oh
have my
yeah, I
own.
know, but
Yeah.
just about artists. Are there any others
Well, you
about
have
art?
5. What's the 5th one?
So I've got my robstolzer.com. That's sort of my general
Right.
catch-all.
Yeah.
I have one called freeassociationfunnies.com.
Right.
That's my work from the past 4 or 5 years. That's, not comics oriented, but influenced by comics. But then the one that's my most recent passion is my
Yeah,
inkslingers.a.
yeah.
And that's the one, that's my blog post. And I just have a long list of,
Yeah.
long list of blog topics I want to write about. And again, I like to go in depth on that stuff. I mean, it'd be easy for me to just, post, here's a new thing I got and here's a little bit of info. But I like to present the context. So the most recent one I did was about Alex Toth and the sketch pages he used
I
to do.
saw that. I saw
Yeah,
that.
I love that stuff. I love anything having to do with
I shared
process.
that with some Hanna-Barbera fans of mine, and they really got a kick out of that too.
Well, and here's the thing, like we talked about animation early on. I will admit I've never been a great fan of animation cells, but the animation drawings I think are incredible. I mean, that's
I have more drawings than cells.
yeah, I mean, so to me, that's where the process really gets going. The in-betweeners, creating the cells off of those, the skill level's different, the creativity is different. And I don't know, there's something about the preliminary stuff I've always really liked, and I've got a lot of that stuff. And again, collectors don't care about that stuff by and large
Yeah.
because they're
I
not finished pieces.
Yeah.
I have a picture right there of from What's Opera Doc below from
Yep.
an original drawing, and my parents were like when they bought me it, I convinced them to buy it after like just explaining like why I want it. It's this little tiny sketch layout of Elmer, and he's like very small. And I'm like, he's like, why do you want it? It's such a weird pose. I'm like, that's exactly why I want it. Exactly why I
Well,
want it. It's the production like pose of it.
well, I don't, again, I don't collect animation art, but I still kick myself for missing out. Howard Lowry decades ago auctioned off an exquisite little sketch of Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio. and it was just like this beautiful gesture drawing, had so much movement in it. But again, I was like, well, I collect comic strips. I don't really collect animation, but I could still picture the piece, and every so often I'll look to see if somebody's got it, see if I can find it, because just a gorgeous drawing, and that stuff I find really exciting, because that's, again, those sketches are where things come to life, and that's what I really like to see in the work.
I've always noticed that I think that collectors, regardless of what you collect, collectors click, I think, in some ways. Because I know people who are car collectors, and I know people who collectors, some exceptions, gun, cough. Those collectors of things click. I just think because you immediately understand why you buy something in some ways.
Well, there's all different reasons. I mean, I think,
Yeah,
like I think the current comic book art market is driven in large part by nostalgia.
right.
And so, people of my age who make a hell of a lot more money than I do, can afford to spend the kind of money because they've got the disposable income. I look at the prices of things, I just think it's nuts. But it's hard for me to square in my brain, going to Phil Soulin conventions in 78, 79, 80, and seeing, Sal Buscema pages for $10 that nobody wanted, or John Buscema. I mean, nobody wanted. I mean, you could get, we all know the stories. You could get a Kirby page for $150, $200.
Right.
Nobody
You could
knew.
I mean, there's always those old horror stories of like, I remember meeting Willie Ito for the very first time at a convention, and he said that what they used to do with Warner Brothers cells, and he shudders because I mentioned this to him. They used to just throw them on the floor, and they used to just walk around them like,
Yeah, well, they didn't have any monetary value. Listen, a
no,
friend of mine who's been collecting longer than me, and I've been collecting about 45 years now. He was one of the first people to get a painting from Karl Barks. So we're talking 70s. Back then, a Gump's Daily strip by Sid Smith was worth the same as a Barks painting. So he
holy
traded the
shit.
painting. He traded the painting for a Gump's Daily strip. The Gump's Daily strip is worth about the same today as it was back then. But nobody
Yeah.
has a magic 8 ball
Yeah.
that can.
You always hear those old myths, like, Mort Walker saying that he wanted to make the Cartoon Art Museum. I don't know if this is true because he saw like Crazy Cat Daly's original art like in sewers or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, that I don't know.
So I'll ask my question again. So yes, you have 5 websites, but you have 2 specifically devoted to specific cartoonists. Are you
Yes.
thinking of adding a third? And would that third possibly be George Harriman, which is why I held up this book?
Yeah, probably not.
That's fine. That's
It's a
fine.
very nice book.
Or any other maybe lesser known
Yeah,
artists.
Mark, look, I just retired from teaching. I taught for 33 years.
Yeah.
And I just kind of I want to do what I want to do. I won't do any of this stuff if it's not fun,
Yeah.
if I can't write about the stuff I want to write about, Tom Heinches from Hogan's Alley has given me carte blanche. If I want to write about something, he'll let me do whatever I want to write about. There's no money in it, and that's
Right.
okay because it gives me an outlet, and it gives me a chance to shine a bit more light on cartoonists. George Harriman doesn't need any more light at this point, and Michael's book is fantastic. So much detail, so much flesh added to the bones of Harriman, who was a pretty enigmatic character. But his art is, I mean, I have ideas about doing a blog post about Harriman, but it wouldn't be like a general thing about the strip. It'd be some offbeat thing about the strip, maybe looking at, to me, what I consider the three periods of Harriman. The early stuff that was really this beautiful sort of quickly and beautifully drawn work. The middle period where things kind of slowed down a little bit, when colors added to the Sunday pages, and then the late stuff, which is I kind of liken it to him drawing with one foot in the grave. It's like Johnny Cash's late work where he didn't have a great voice anymore, or Billie Holiday's late work where her voice was almost gone, but you could just still get something from their hearts. That's like Harriman.
Yeah.
So I would like to do something like that, but it's not really website worthy. It's not enough to do it to really do a full kind of a website. So
I wish for two things to be done about Harriman. Three things. Two. One of them is I wish that someone would do a good book of the dailies. I wish that someone like Fantagraphic or someone would reprint the daily strips.
they have been reprinted some.
They've been reprinted also by like off-brand one-offs that, which I honestly have no problem whatsoever from buying comic strip collections from unestablished self-publishers. I don't.
Well, a lot of the stuff is public domain, so
Right,
anybody.
and I honestly
Yeah.
don't see a problem with it, but what bothers me about those though is that they printed like, it seems that they printed like 100 copies and they would print like the first 6 months of the first year, which in the end dwells into a lot of money it would cost you to buy them all.
Well, the thing is though, there's not a lot of money in comic strip reprints.
Yeah.
When Dennis Kitchen was still in Wisconsin, when I moved here, sorry, Max, when Dennis was still in the state, I worked for him before I started teaching, and I worked on like doing paste. We did wax paste ups of books and things.
Oh.
And he published Nancy to help pay for other books because Cottonwoods wasn't going to make any money. I'd say probably, The Spirit, Little Abner, and Nancy were the things that made the money,
Yeah.
for Dennis back then.
But
But that allowed him to do other projects because they helped pay for those projects. So that stuff's in public domain. That's why I think it was Eclipse who did the Crazy Enigmax books in the 80s. They
Right.
couldn't use Crazy Cat because that's copyrighted, but they could use.
Right. Is that why the Fantagraphic calls them that too?
I don't know. I don't remember them doing. I don't remember them calling it that. But I'll be honest with you. I've never been as interested in the dailies as I have in the Sunday pages.
Right. And the other thing I liked in the reprint is they did those. They I know they did the Family Upstairs a long time ago. I don't have $1,000 to buy a reprint book in acceptable condition though.
The Hyperion.
I'm a grad student next year. I don't have that money.
The Hyperion books, but the old Hyperion books aren't that expensive.
Yeah.
So that's the series of books you mentioned. Blackbeard before. Bill was the editor for those Hyperion books.
I've seen them online though for like $1,000 a copy of it. I'm like,
oh, I would ask though, are they selling for $1,000?
No, because the same $1,000 copy is the same one online that I keep seeing.
Yeah, no, you can find them. I see them on eBay, from time to time, and they're not they might be $35-$40.
Yeah, I can afford that.
They did the Baron Bean. They reprinted Baron Bean.
I know Library of American Comics did that too, but I would love to see a reprinted book also because they did something like this with Winsor McCay at one point.
Yep.
Where they reprinted all of Winsor McCay's miscellaneous strips at one point.
Yep.
I'd love to see them do that with George Harriman.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's a twofold issue. One are the resources, both in terms of monetary, but also in terms of source material.
Right.
A lot of that paper isn't around anymore, especially that early stuff. Once what Bill did and what the Johnson brothers did, Mark and Cole Johnson. I know Cole's no longer with us. Mark, I think, still around. But those guys saved books from being destroyed by libraries.
Bill Blackbeard, I did remember I did a whole final term paper on Bill Blackbeard and comic preservation. I interviewed you for it.
Yep. Yeah. No, he was a character, and he saved a lot of material for a lot of people, And what was nice about Bill was, you could write him, and for whatever, like $20 or something, he would copy off a year of a daily strip or something for you. So he would dig through his stacks, and I wish I could have seen his setup in San Francisco. I visited the Johnson brothers once in Pennsylvania, and it was basically a hoarder house. You're walking in aisles between stacks of newspapers.
When I did profile, I filed the Bill Blackbeard legacy enough for my term paper, which I never even got it finished because I was so in depth in the work that my professor just says, you've done enough. I'm just going to give you an A. Please go back and do your other homework. So I just had to stop doing it and never even got it done. Which brought to a problem when Brian Walker says, "Hey, I'd love to read your thing." I'm like,
You'll have to finish
because
it
my
sometime.
professor was just like, "Hey, you've done enough. You've got 100 on the assignment. Go do your other homework." But I went to Columbus for the Bill Blackbeard exhibit, and they gave me a whole tour of the Billy Ireland Museum behind the scenes, and
It's
that's the
incredible.
moment when I'm looking at Bill Blackbeard, what he's doing, and I was looking for also for schools because I'm majoring now. I'm going to Indiana University in the fall for library and information sciences.
Hmm.
And I'm like, I look at Bill Blackbeard and I look at what everyone's doing. I'm like, this is what I want to do. Not just comics, but just archiving in general. The whole archiving field and library sciences is what I like.
Well, and I think, these days, because comics are taken so much more seriously,
Yeah.
I think it becomes a much more viable opportunity. I mean, look at Karen Green at Columbia and what she's able to do with the collection there. I look at, what Jenny and Caitlin are doing at OSU, what Lucy Caswell started there. I mean, that's
Yeah. Lucy Caswell was
incredible.
also the person who I interviewed. She was the very first person I interviewed, which I later learned that she doesn't do interviews very often. And I
Well,
interviewed
she's
her for about,
she's retired, and so
but I got to talk to her for about 2 hours. So
yep, yeah. So I mean, you come to appreciate the people who really just kind of did this stuff because they're passionate about the field. I mean, I don't think Bill was making much money doing what he was doing, driving trucks around to pick up, bound volumes of newspapers across the country. But
when you have over half a over half when you have over half a dozen worth of full semi trucks of newspaper delivered, you've got a lot of shit.
Yes. So I have to
Which I have a lot of stuff, but I also don't. I have a lot of stuff, as you can see around me. I bought loads worth of toys and everything. I also do not wish I have that much stuff though.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, there's collectors who are volume collectors. There's collectors who are kind of black hole collectors where stuff goes in and it never comes out and it's never really used in some way. I've always collected in a way, if I could buy three of something and sell one or two of those things, make my money back and keep my favorite thing out of that, that's always seemed to work for me. But I've got a small office and I've got a small storage area in our basement area. And I don't collect figurines. I don't collect sort of the ancillary stuff. I can't. I have to stay focused on the stuff. And even books. I mean, you were talking about um, wishing that, Harriman would be reprinted more. We live in such a golden age of reprints right now. I can't keep up. I can't
I
afford
can't
to,
either.
I can't afford to. I mean, what Pete Maresca is doing with Sunday Page Press,
Yep.
what I'm looking at my Terry and the Pirates and Little Orphan Annie and
Yeah.
the LA.
Peanuts and
There are those, I mean, the collections are incredible today. I know there's a new Terry and the Pirates collection. I have two Terry and the Pirates collections already. I don't need a third one. I'm sure the reprinting is incredible, but I mean, at some point,
I
it's like it's got to be enough.
I have the negative that both of you don't have, and that is that I am many years younger than you, meaning that I missed a lot.
Yeah,
Right?
but you'll also see when I'm dead and gone, you'll be seeing a lot more than I've ever
Yeah.
seen. I mean, this is to me, this is the best time
Yeah.
to be starting in this area because there's so many resources available to
The
you.
one problem I have being a person who watches old movies and animation and comic strips is that I got a full shelf in my closet and I got a full shelf in my bedroom. They're all so full that my parents are afraid they're gonna break. Yet I can't stop buying books because I just love it.
Yeah, but that's how you curate a collection, though. No, it
Yeah.
really is, and that's
Yeah.
why I think it's
I
important to have
mean,
a focus.
I like having my big little books displayed, and I'm gonna keep them that way.
Mhm.
Just curious, Camden. I never asked you. I mean, you're young. You can still buy, but do you ever sell anything?
Do I ever sell anything? I I asked Tim Hollis the same thing. Do you ever purge? He says, never. I never purge. I
Oh,
do purge.
I
when
do
it
too.
comes to the point where, like, when I was buying, anything that had a Warner Brothers character on it when I was 8, well, most of that stuff means nothing. I could give a crap of what Taz was on in the 1990s. I want something from the 1960s, so I get rid of all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do purge.
Okay, because I'm
When
curious
time
because
comes that I'm no longer interested in something, it's purged.
yeah,
It happens all the
yeah,
time.
which is fine. I do the same thing. It's like, and I try to keep, this is totally off topic, but I'm a huge Beatles fan. You know how many Beatles things there are.
Oh
Well,
yeah,
three or four.
Yeah,
yeah.
So I mean, it's like I've gone through. I used to have probably about 200 Beatles books. Probably now I have about 50 because you go through and I go, I'm never going to read this one again. This is some guy's opinion. This is not
Yeah.
informational. This is this, that's that. And so you get rid of those and keep the cream of the crop of everything.
Right.
And you could do that on any
I-
subject. I
and
just
I-
happen to mention Beatles, but
And I'm
every other
looking on my shelf and I find that I have books in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I'm like, I don't even like the Marvel movies. I'm more of a DC guy. Why do I need these Marvel books? I'm just gonna get rid of them.
yeah, okay.
Right.
So
Well,
you're
and
learning.
again-
Buy more Popeye.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh
and
yeah,
again,
Popeye. Anything with Popeye on it, it's not gonna like. I don't know if you've been to the Popeye Museum, and I've shown this on Mark's podcast many times, but I'm proud of it. I don't know if you've been to the Popeye Museum, the fan museum in Chester, Illinois.
no, that's where he was born. I know. Yeah.
I bought this there. They let me buy this. This is
Oh,
a
wow.
1942 Sirocco figure.
Nice.
You see, that kind of stuff I'm not going to get rid of. But I mean,
Right.
the Popeye toys that I bought when I was 10, that they're from the 90s, they're gone. They're going to be gone.
Right. But and again, I mean, for as long as I've been collecting comic art, sometimes I'll buy things with an eye on selling things so that I can afford to buy other
Yeah.
things. And for a time I was doing an e-sales list a few times a year, but school got so busy. I think I did one last year and haven't done one in a number of months, but I've got one. I've started to work on one for August. And if I can do a sales list every 4 or 5 months, 2, 3 months, whatever, that helps to replenish the coffers, to pick up more things. But at the same time, I've been collecting for 45 years. I'm 61. I don't plan on having a Viking funeral and burning all this
Uh-huh.
stuff. And so, I'm not taking anything with me, so if there's ever grandkids, some of this stuff will be sold for college funds, things like that.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
don't I don't understand the idea that I know there are certain collectors that they refuse to like. There are certain collectors that, though I can think of, that probably would refuse the idea of having their stuff sold when they die. They want their kids to have it or whatever. I personally think it should be sold or go to an archive. Like, if I was older, I would say, do whatever you want with it as long as it goes to a good place, because it's not going to be a good place rotting around here when I'm
Right.
gone.
well, the reality of the situation is when that collector is dead, they no longer have a say where it goes.
Yeah.
Recent. I don't know if you follow the heritage auctions, but Bob Murphy's
Yeah.
collection of Terry and the Kniff work was up there for a number of months. And Bob collected for decades, and I didn't know him well. I just knew him a little bit. We did one trade, 25 or 30 years ago, but he had nobody to really leave the work to. And so it all went to heritage, and now other collectors get to enjoy that stuff. And so,
I-
should stuff go to archives? I mean, I get asked that, frequently. Part of this is my retirement. I've invested a lot into it, both money wise and kind of sweat equity and research. And so in my case, probably won't go to any archives. It'll be sold eventually.
I think so.
Oh, good.
By the way, I wanted to ask, I know that there's a person who does animation art, fake art. He posts about fake animation art that's being sold, and he also does stuff with comic books and comic strips and all that because they're kind of like sister mediums. But he's noticed that there's a lot of fakes being sold on heritage auctions right now for art and drawings.
I don't see a lot of fakes on heritage. I've seen some.
Yeah.
I've seen some at most major auction houses.
See more on eBay.
Yeah, definitely more on eBay.
Oh
and
yeah,
definitely-
eBay. There's got to be some factory in Peru selling off weird fakes of art.
Well, Italy is one place where they're coming from. Brazil. I joke with people that after Dr. Seuss passed away, there were no more inscribed drawings being offered. When Dr. Seuss was alive, he was pretty generous and he would send out drawings and they were always inscribed to the recipient. But when he passed away, all of a sudden, no drawings were inscribed anymore. I think I have, if I can find.
Yeah, it seems that every Schultz, it seems that everyone has a Schultz drawing. And the very bottom and the very small print on eBay, it says this produce was made by or in the styling of the creator.
Yes.
And a very, very small printing to like legally get out of it.
That's the way that they.
And I often look at reviews. Reviews are either two things. I notice for these things. Either one, they're fake. They're fake reviews by robots or whatever.
Oh, cool.
Oh, cool.
So that was inscribed to me. He was very generous. You sent him something and you included a self-addressed padded envelope and he would send it back to you and inscribe it.
You sent that particular book.
I sent that book. I've got a couple books signed by him. He did on his stationery, he did a drawing of a Flit can for me. He used to do the Quick Henry the Flit ads, the bug spray ads. And I've got another Cat in the Hat drawing. It wasn't a big deal back then, I don't think they were bombarded as much as people are today.
Right. Yeah. What was that?
I also wanted to say though that I think that it's always I've seen it's always 3 people that 4 people who get faked on comics and notice. It's 5 people. For some reason they think Andy Warhol is a comic artist. Every drawing of Mickey Mouse has Andy Warhol signature on it, and I'm not really sure why. Mark, you've seen those weird Andy Warhol drawings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how do
you pronounce that guy's name? To or Toe?
I have no idea.
Oh, okay.
Who is that?
The one that has the website on Facebook of fakes. His first name is spelled T-O, and I don't know if it's Toe or Two or.
Oh, is that Toe Frug? Is that?
Yeah,
Yes.
But I don't know how to pronounce it. If that's how you pronounce
it.
I'm
not sure.
Okay, and I don't want to mispronounce it, but I always say Toe Frug, but I don't know if that's the case,
Then there's Kirby, of course.
Yeah.
And then there's Schultz.
Yeah.
And then there's Dr. Seuss. But then there's Bob Kane. Apparently, everyone thinks that, and these fakers think that Bob Kane drew everything.
Yeah.
It'll be like a picture of Superman with Bob Kane's signature on it. And I'm like, when is this coming from? Where are their sources for this?
Bob Kane's authentic sketches were pretty bad, so
yeah.
Sometimes the forgeries are too good.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are others.
They look like Grant Morrison just drew it.
I'm sure there were others, but when they were alive, I remember seeing a lot of Schultz. And what was the other one though? You just said his name. I can't even remember.
Kirby.
Not Kirby, strangely enough. I can't remember the other one, but
Kirby's fakes are so bad. I can't take that seriously.
But it's just funny, I guess Schultz never clamped down on it too much when he was around. He figured, it's like, but you could tell, it's easy to tell the Schultz.
People think those characters are easy to draw. They're not.
No, but anyway. What was I going to ask? Oh, Rob, so you were a teacher for a number of years.
Yep.
Did you teach art history, or what did you teach? And did you teach a number of different things?
I taught mostly studio classes, painting, drawing, illustration. I taught a graphic narration class. I didn't teach art history per se, although I taught it in some of the classes, and I taught kind of an art appreciation for non-major class, but that was a combination lecture and studio because I wanted the non-majors to have a chance to be able to draw as well, because a lot of the students wanted that opportunity. The graphic narration class was a class I created. I really love doing it. I'm not a fan of the term graphic novels because so many of what we think of as graphic novels are not novels at all. I mean, you think about, Mouse is not a novel. So graphic novels to me, the term doesn't encompass nonfiction. So I prefer graphic narration. So, and I'd use that class as a way to introduce students to the history of comic art some, I came up with a reader for the class that reprinted a bunch of things. I'm big on the EC war books as incredible storytelling. Any of like the Kurtzman edited EC books, they're like 8 pages of how to draw something in comic books, how to tell a story. They're brilliant, and so I just kind of gave the students an overview and would put in some lectures, something about Harriman, something about Cliff Sterrett. And I found, publishers to be very generous, providing scans. Peter Maresca provided some scans from some of his books because they're not easy to scan from his books.
Right.
So he kindly sent some stuff. So any way to get students involved to introduce them to that stuff, I thought was really important. And it's interesting for me. I was talking about context before. Um, I did a whole section on this for the students on Bill Malden, and I think
Hmm.
Bill Malden to me was one of the most important cartoonists of the last century because I think without Malden, we didn't have those EC war books with that sort of pacifistic anti-war view because most of those guys were vets of World War II. And so they saw Malden's work, and then they took that same sort of vibe and brought it into the EC books. And I'm not sure that we would have even had MASH without Malden, because the humor of Malden is the same black humor that you
I,
found in MASH. And I know there weren't a lot of guys. I think Jamie Farr was the only cast member who was a vet. I think he was in the Korean conflict. Actually, I think he was in the Korean War. Yeah, I think
right, but that
so.
show also
Um,
comes from the play and then the movie, and
yeah. So, but I think again, Malden was so influential in all that stuff because the humor is pretty similar,
well,
throughout.
Yeah.
So again, I like
Malden.
I like drawing those parallels with the students.
Well,
Well,
I was at the World War II Museum in New Orleans the other day for a Disney and World War II exhibit. I also went to Tom Hanks's, and it's in New Orleans. I went to Tom Hanks's Beyond the Boundaries film, which is a 4D film about World War II, and Bill Malden is in that movie.
Hmm.
Really, a lot of it.
He was incredible. I mean, you read about his life. Um, Todd DiPastino wrote probably the best autobiography or best biography of Malden. I know there's another one in the works by a different author, but he and his brother left home, I think, when Malden was like 12 years old, and his brother, I think, was 14. They drove out of the mountains of New Mexico to go to Arizona so they could go to school. Um, he was doing those cartoons from the front lines in Italy when he was 21 years old. I mean, you look at the quality of the work and you look at the maturity of the work, it's mind-boggling. It really was.
Was it your website that had the picture of Gregor Duncan with Bill Malden?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay,
So
that's what I thought.
when Duncan, um, uh, how
Or
can I put
blog, I
this?
should say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the Duncan website. So
Yeah.
Duncan was pretty old to be drafted. When his mother passed away, he enlisted. I think he was like 30, 33, somewhere around there. Don't hold me to that. And then when he was sent to the Mediterranean Theater, he was sent to Sicily for that to that Stars and Stripes office. Ed Vabel was the guy who ran the office out of Sicily, and he had Malden show Duncan around. So they got to know each other for a couple of weeks before. I mean, Malden wasn't there he was there like a month before he got killed and before he got killed in action on an assignment. But they got to know each other pretty well. I think I've got a quote from Malden or by Malden on the website that was from. I can't remember if it was from Upfront or one of Malden's other books, but he thought quite highly of Duncan.
Of course,
And
One of
it
the
was interesting though. I got to talk to Vabel. He passed away just a few years ago, but I called him up, and he's telling me He's the one who convinced Malden to draw with a brush instead of a pen. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's right around the time that Malden put down his pen and picked up a brush, and the change was incredible. I mean, it's like within like a 3 or 4 month period, the work was just incredibly mature at that point.
I have a question, by the way, about Michael's Harriman book, George Harriman book.
Yeah.
And it is described by press as
Are you getting a commission, Mark?
No, I haven't even read it yet. I just bought it because someday I'll read this. We were talking before the show. I'll let you talk in a second, but we were talking to the show. We have books we want to read, and I tend to pick these up because I go, I know I will read this at one point, but I have about 10 books I'm reading ahead of time. Anyway,
No,
go
I'm
ahead.
a very slow reader, so I got tons of books on my shelf I haven't read.
And we were the first campus that Michael lectured to about the book.
Yeah.
So we're like 2017 or something like that.
He lectured at
There he is.
There he is. He's such a good guy. I helped him with some of the research on that. We met down in his family is big into chess, and his son was taking part in a chess tournament in Madison, which is a couple hours south of me. So we met at the UW down there because they have this incredible archive that hardly anybody goes to see. And they had letters by Claire Dwiggins where he talks about Harriman and getting together with Harriman in LA. So we went through the archives and made photocopies, and we're looking for things that he could use to kind of flesh out in the book.
Ironically, if you ever follow Harriman's life, you could also follow early silent movies with it too, because he was at Hal Roach.
Yep.
He had like an office at Hal Roach. I know he had.
Yep.
He knew Chaplin. I think he was friendly with Buster Keaton at one point. I've read.
He was drawing on the Roach set. I know, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's insane. Because I was reading the Laurel and Hardy. Randy Scriven has a Laurel and Hardy book, which I highly recommend. And it mentions very briefly, but it does mention in one of the early silent Laurel and Hardys, it says that Harriman worked on some thing and to do with it. And I'm like, wait, George Harriman? And apparently I asked Randy and they said, yep, Harriman was on the set of the Roach Law. I'm like, wow.
Yep. Yeah, they're shooting the Our Gang shorts there, at that time. I mean, it's pretty amazing what they're doing.
And one of the things that always interested me is I was not, I was like, let me put this perspective. I was 7 when the book Schultz and Peanuts came out. I was like 7 or 8. Okay. So, but it's always advertised, it's advertised back further as like in the vein of Schultz and Peanuts. But in my understanding, wasn't Schultz and Peanuts not considered a very good book?
You're talking that big, thick yellow one?
Big, thick yellow book with the stripe on it.
That one I've not read. Is that the David? David Michelin?
The family didn't like it, and I started reading it. I found it kind of dull. I found Charles Schultz interviews book and similar ones to that much better reads. So it's like,
is that the book where the author kind of psychoanalyzes?
Yeah,
that's the book. That's the book.
Yeah. I've not read it. I mean, look, I think there's certain strips it's sort of interesting to know about somebody's life, and certain strips it doesn't really even matter. I mean, if you can't get a sense of Charles Schultz from Peanuts, then you're not really reading Peanuts.
And Charles Schultz had his own autobiography.
It was a comic strip.
Yeah.
I mean, there's things I think are fascinating about Schultz, and I think he had a love of classic comics. He was a big Percy Crosby fan.
He was big on Popeye, I know. Huge.
Yeah. What's that?
He was huge on Popeye.
Yeah, I wouldn't surprise me.
It's huge on Bill Malden. We'll tie it into there too.
Bill Malden, exactly. He was big on Bill Malden.
But he was also wasn't he like captain of a machine gun squad or something? For World War II. So he would have been intimately familiar with Malden's work, because to the grunts in the field, I mean, Malden was like a god. He was the one who was speaking for them where they couldn't speak themselves. So it's not a surprise. It's so thinking about Malden and Peanuts together, it doesn't seem to fit, but he made it.
And there is a strip they both drew together. I don't know if you knew that, like 96 or something.
Yeah,
like that.
or Schultz used images of
It
Malden's.
might
I'm
have
not
been, but
sure.
he'd
Yeah, I
still
don't
give
know
him
that they
credit,
drew it together.
So
Yeah,
it's like,
but Malden was so influential. I mean, Ralph Bakshi is a huge fan of Malden's and tried to do an animation special with him, and
Yeah,
he tried to.
but that's a strip that just doesn't. I think that there are certain strips that work. I think I've argued with this before about adapting comic strips. I love those Fleischer Popeye cartoons, and I really like them, but I really don't think that they even come close to adapting that strip well. Or like any I've talked to you about this endlessly, how I don't think they adapted it.
I don't think
I
they were
know,
meant
I
to.
know.
I don't think they were meant to adapt the strip well. I mean,
No,
I don't think they were meant to be an adaptation of the strip. I mean, look, my wife and I just came back on Friday. We watched the new Mission Impossible movie.
right,
And it's brain candy. It's sort of edge of your seat brain candy for 2.5 hours.
right,
That those movies have nothing to do with the original series, or very
right.
little to do with the original series. I mean, the original series to me was so sedate compared to what the Tom Cruise movies are. So the Fleischer movies I loved as a kid. We used to see them on TV. They'd
Yeah,
be in black and white or color. I had no idea who Seagar was at the time.
yeah, exactly.
Those
That
were
was me growing up.
those were my introduction to Popeye, and they're not the strip, and the strip is not them. I sort of just saw them as totally different entities,
I
just
did
like
too, but
the Peanuts cartoons are not the Peanut strips.
I think that in fact, for me, my personal opinion is for the Peanuts specials. I think that most of them aren't just very good.
Right.
Most of the animated stuff. The first five are fine. The first two are great. Three are great, but I don't think that they are even close to being the same thing as the strip. Or like, I know that Harriman was not a fan, and I like them for what they are. But as long as you don't pretend that they're not them, is those animated Crazy Cat cartoons.
Mhm.
I know Harriman was not a fan of those. I've heard.
No, and I don't pay attention to them very much, honestly. I mean, I guess the problem for me with some of the properties that become popular in a different medium is, growing up, I had an idea in my head what the characters sounded like from reading the comics, and
Yeah,
they weren't anything like the cartoons.
and then
They
Crazy
weren't.
Cat was supposed to be female. Well,
Well, yeah, and again,
yeah,
I've seen some of that stuff. I don't, the Charles Mintz Crazy Cat things. They're not Harriman.
right. They're like a different cat
There's a reason
entirely.
why. There's a reason why Crazy Cat died with Harriman. There's a
Yeah.
reason why Peanuts died with Schultz. There's
Right.
a reason why nobody's doing Calvin and Hobbes
Yeah.
anymore, because they're just not. Nobody can carry them on like those guys did.
In defense of the Peanut specials, I'll say at least Schultz worked on them,
I
Yes,
think so
unlike some
too.
of
yes,
these
Yeah.
other cases that you're saying.
I
yep.
I think though that when I remember when I first discovered Seagar's Popeye is my favorite comic strip, followed closely by Schultz, Pogo, and Crazy Cat. But Seagar is my favorite comic strip because just the idea of because I remember watching the Fleischer cartoons and the famous cartoons. We can go into a different story about why the famous cartoons, the later after the 40s color ones aren't very good. Mark, you'll know that discussion well. But but the flight those Seagar strips are like an adventure storytelling. It's like the best adventure strip combined with the best comedic strip. You've got the gruffest, most ugly character in the world. And he's in and Olive's not a flanky female in the strip. She's almost as gruff as Popeye is in the strip. And they're basically going to Dice Island. They're going on this surrealistic, if you allow the words, completely surrealistic worlds based on just Seagar's own imagination.
Yeah, but in the end, any artist who makes you buy into their reality is doing their job. I mean, I remember reading something that Joe Kubert said about drawing Tarzan. He basically said he was trying to make a movie, and
Right.
that it was his goal to bring the viewer in for
I mean,
however many pages that movie was going to last for. But it's an interesting point you mentioned about the adventure. I mean, there were to me kind of two different kind of adventure strips. There were the more gritty, realistic strips, Terry and the Pirates and Scorchy Smith and what was
Canyon.
Frank Robbins strip, Prince Valiant, and then you had more cartoony strips like Alley Oop, I think,
Yeah.
straddled between cartoony and almost an animated sort of quality. He had like that thick and thin contour line that Minja McKay used in Little Nemo. But then Roy Crane to me is really the master of the adventure strip in that sort of Bigfoot cartoony style. But man, could he write a strip? He could draw anything. And it wasn't like that realistic sort of a strip. And so there were a couple different schools of these sort of strips that were going on at the same time. And I get such a kick out of that they can all work in different ways. And, again, the thing with the students I try and put into context for them was, movies are fairly young in the 20s, very young. Radio is in its infancy in the 20s. I mean, you've got comic strips was your adventure. You're seeing that every day in the newspaper. You're following what's going to happen. I mean, we're spoiled by reprint books because we could see 5 strips on a page, and then
I'm spoiled by growing up with the internet. Let's put this perspective with me here.
Yeah, no, I mean, so it's very different today because you don't have to wait to read an entire year. But can you imagine, Harry Tudhill and the Bungle family? He had some storylines that went on for like 4 and 5 months.
Yeah, or like
people are following these every single day in the newspaper.
I think that's the problem with I don't hate Bud Sagendorf's Popeye strip, but they're so slow. They seem to go on forever.
It might be an attention thing though too, where we want things a little. I mean, look at today. If you're somebody who streams, TV shows, when a show is released, oftentimes it's all released at once.
Yeah.
And I've got friends who might stream an entire season, in a weekend. I can't do that. I can watch maybe 3 max of something. I just don't have the patience to sit there and watch the whole thing. But there, back in the 30s, you're having to wait every day, for those comic strips to come out. I once did a study for myself. I think I did this during the 90s. I compared strips from around 1931 to strips from whenever I did this comparison around 95, something like that.
Like Calvin and Hobbes or something like that.
How many words were in a strip?
Oh yeah.
That's a big difference.
In the early 30s, late 20s, they average about 135 words in a strip. And in the contemporary comic strips, they average about 15 words in a strip. Part of that had to do with the shrinking size of the newspapers. Right. So back then the strips might have run across the entire page, and now they're running 2 column. But the storylines are different. Now they're mainly gag a day, or if they're continuity, there'll be a little bit more of a dialogue, but you just can't have a lot anymore. So I think the strips have lost something, but I don't know that people have the patience to read 135 words every day.
I have a question for you, Rob, because as someone who studies the art of comic strips, do you think there's a future for comic strips?
Yeah.
This is puzzled for years. People.
Well, I know Mark wanted to ask something, then or interject something.
Well, I will say I'll add my 2 cents on that, and then I'll say the other thing. But yeah, as long as there's the internet, because comic strips don't have to be published in a newspaper.
Right.
There's that. Right. But I was going to say this about adventure strips in the past versus now, or even any sort of strip of continuity. You could even include Peanuts in that. In the older days, it seemed like, and Popeye did this a lot, they did a recap strip of like what's been going on, because they assumed you missed it. You didn't read it every day or something, or you need to be caught up, or maybe this is the first time you're seeing it, and it's 10 weeks into the strip. You don't want to, find 10 weeks worth of newspapers. Nowadays, they assume, the access to this, or if you're lost, you'll figure it out. Right. But they don't do that a lot.
The strips aren't really reliant on what came before necessarily.
Right, that too.
This week, Patrick McConnell's been doing kind of these meta mutts, I call them, where they're strips about the characters being aware of where they are in a comic strip, and they're talking about the space of the strip and stuff. and they're adorable. I mean, they're really fun sort of strips, but you know, you didn't have to know he did it on Tuesday to get the gag on Thursday, but all week he's been doing that. And I emailed Patrick about one of them because I thought it was really funny. He's like, you know, I've been doing this for like 30 years. I'm just trying to keep myself entertained, you know, at this point. And I know when I used to write to Hank Ketchum, it was kind of the same thing. He always appreciated feedback, but he's like, you know, I've been drawing this kid for 40 years. It's like, you know, 365 days a year. Well, he wasn't doing Sunday pages, you know, 315 days a year, whatever. He's been doing the daily strip. And so I think at some point these guys are just trying to keep themselves entertained, but they're not reliant on what happened before or what happens after.
It's like a movie serial. You're not supposed to watch the movie serial episode after episode after episode. That's why they have those recaps at the beginning. You know, they
Right.
were meant to be played in a movie theater, not directly in front of each other.
Well,
I think
you'll also notice if you look at older strips, oftentimes the Saturday strips are oftentimes kind of loosely tied to the story, but not integral because they realized people weren't commuting on Saturdays usually. They
Yeah.
weren't as invested on Saturdays. And so you weren't seeing that exact same sort of continuity that you might otherwise.
I mean, I always liked, by the way, when you said about Mutts, I've been a big Mort Walker fan, particularly Beetle Bailey, really just Beetle Bailey, but I also love his magazine cartoon work, but I also really love his strip Sam strip,
Hmm.
like the comic strip within a comic strip. I love that. And I
Yeah.
remember visiting the Mort Walker thing. They had something at Columbia University. My brother went to school there, so he flew me up there and I got to go and see it. I got the camp swapping hat and all that kind of stuff. But then I remember sitting and I guess the statue of Beetle Bailey there. But I remember getting this book called Sandstrip. I'm like, I've never seen it. And then you see, like, you know, him referencing, you know, New York World cartoons with the giant globe and everything. And I'm like, this is the sweetest thing I've ever seen. Because this is like a comic strip world. You know, he's bathing with Donald Duck or whatever.
Yeah. And they're very popular now. They're the originals. Yeah.
I remember when Mort Walker put out My Life with the Strips or something. It came out in '73. You probably have it.
Backstage.
Yeah.
uh,
A
and
backstage at the strips, I think. Is
Yeah.
that the
yeah,
one?
Backstage is in
Yeah.
strips. Thank
Yeah.
you. Anyway, that's where I first heard about Sand Strip because you know I didn't grow up in the '60s, even though I was born in '66. So I said, man, I wish I could see those strips. They sounded really neat. They had a couple examples, but you know, it wasn't until years later, and that's probably the book you're referring to, Camden.
Yeah,
that they
the one
recreated
with
all of them. And I go, that's why, you know, like we said earlier, Camden, this is why you're growing up at the best time because, yeah, you just
I have the internet.
you
If I
could
wanted
just
to look it up,
you
I
could
could
just
look it up
order that,
online.
you know.
Yep.
I could just drool over the two examples that were in Backstage at the Strips and hope I could see some more someday, maybe if I found an old newspaper collector.
But
You know?
that's but that's when Blackbeard's Smithsonian book came out, I think that was a game changer
Yeah.
Yeah.
because while I've got all my Hyperion books are up on a shelf up here. I've got my Galewitz book might be, I don't know if it's here, if it's downstairs. I've got a lot more books downstairs. But the Blackbeard book changed everything because it was beautiful. I mean, it was a real production, a real high-end production. And for those of us who were interested in that stuff, we didn't see that before.
Yeah.
I mean, Gelwitz, you would find like, Winnie Winkle, the breadwinner strips, where he had touched up the strips really horribly, like he might have used a flare pen or something to do it. But that's what you had because there wasn't, unless you were collecting the tear sheets or the clip dailies, which I didn't really know anybody who was at the time. That's what you had. So, seeing the Blackbeard stuff is like, holy, that just
That was
like
It
that was
whets
neat
you,
for
it whets your appetite for more stuff.
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
me for Brian Walker's book too, though, because I was just all I was familiar with was Beetle Bailey and Blondie. I wasn't even familiar with Blondie when it was actually a really, really good strip from like
Yeah.
its early days.
Yep.
And I was and Beetle Bailey and Blondie, and I was just familiar with Garfield and all that stuff. But then I'm like looking at I didn't understand Pogo at the time, but I'm looking at Popeye, and I'm like, but Popeye's a comic strip, or I'm looking at Bringing Up Father, or I'm looking at whatever, and I'm like, this stuff is so cool. Or I'm looking at Superman or something like that.
So you keep referring to yourself as like not having been around then, and so like you're just now discovering this stuff, and I'm actually kind of envious of that because you're getting to discover this stuff that I think is such a vital. I don't know if it's not a purely American art form,
Yeah.
but the States has had a big part in the development of that art form, and you've got so much that you're going to be seeing that just kind of blows your mind. That's why I love introducing that stuff to my students because they didn't know who Bill Malden was.
Yeah.
They didn't know who Cliff Sterrett was. I mean,
The
they didn't
difference
know.
is I had to discover for myself, which is more fun that way.
Yeah.
Well,
But the cool part now, this is what I'm trying to say, is you have the benefit of the internet. So if you want to say,
Exactly.
if there's a book about the Gumps, let me see. Type in the
yeah,
Gumps
click, click,
book.
click,
Yeah.
click, click.
There it
Hey,
is.
what were they doing?
Hey,
What
it's
were they doing? I
$1,000,
saw
but hey, one exists, and I can see right now. When we were kids, meaning Rob and
Yeah,
I don't know if there's a book about the Gumps. Maybe there
there,
is, and then
there were, but they were.
you look in classified ads. Nobody'd be
Yeah,
advertising because nobody cared, And it's like, and then you go to like comic shows, and since it was really old from the 20s, nobody had it, and so you didn't know for sure. And then you'd find some collector weirdo that was like 80 years old that had like everything, And then you go, okay, I guess there was a book,
yeah,
But then
but
how do you find it, And
the
then
joy
that's
of that was,
yeah, yeah,
Couples and Leon was one of the early comic strip publishers.
yeah,
They reprinted comic strips in the 20s and 30s. So they reprinted a lot of the Smitty comic strips, Dick Tracy. They
yeah,
did like 9 volumes of Little Orphan Annie. When I discovered those, then I started hunting around used bookstores and stuff, and you could find them coverless, for $15,
yeah,
$20.
yeah.
And then Dover did their reprints from those books in the 70s and 80s. And then after that, we started getting into some of the newer reprints. But the reprints have always been around. It's just that, if you didn't grow up in the 20s, you didn't know about them until
Yeah.
you stumbled across them. And even today, there's are either of you guys familiar with George Storm?
Mhm.
Sounds
Ring a
familiar.
bell. So in the Hyperion books, Bobby Thatcher was one of his main characters, and then he ghosted for another comic strip. And Couples and Leon did a Bobby Thatcher comic as well. But that's really it for George Storm, and he was a brilliant cartoonist. Somebody on one of the Facebook groups, Dee Dee Deggs, I think, reprinted a Swiss Family Robinson story that he did in comic strip form, and it is some brilliant drawing. And so he's somebody covering a blog because that's the thing. There's not a lot out there on him. I've only seen one original piece of comic strip art by him in 45 years of collecting. I don't know if it all got destroyed, and he was a prolific artist. But there's still a lot of guys who are like that out there, that they're not your Seagars that everybody knows about, or Harriman or Gould or those guys. But there's some really incredible cartoonists that
Yeah.
they just sort of they died and are forgotten now.
I wrote an article, and this made me feel good. I wrote an article about Ralph Heimdall, who did the Bugs Bunny comic strip, and his daughter. And a week later, his daughter emailed me saying, "I loved your article. I want to do another one with you."
Hmm.
I'm doing another one with her.
Well, and that's the way that somebody gets to be known by an audience. I mean,
Right.
that's the reason why I do the Inkslinger, blog. I'm not making any money off it. I'm not
No.
monetizing it in any way. But I did a piece about George Clark and the panels he did during World War II. George Clark is one of the greatest cartoonists in cartoon history, as far as I'm concerned, just in terms of sheer like draftsmanship, sheer drawing capability. Well, I heard from two of his grandchildren how thankful they were
Yeah.
that, and through that, I discovered that one of Clark's sons is still alive, living in Buffalo. So he's somebody I need to contact because that's something I could turn into a Hogan's Alley piece if I can get to him in time, not to be
Yeah.
morbid. But that's the thing you run into. There's not many people left, from those
Yeah.
periods. I mean, Michael Tisserand, got to visit with Harriman's granddaughter, and so that added a lot to the book because
Yeah.
there weren't many people with firsthand knowledge, and she was a kid when he died, so her recollection of him wasn't all that great. But I think it's really important. Anybody who's involved in this field, interview people when you can, or talk to people who knew these people, because again, those firsthand experiences, you don't know when they're going to disappear on you.
I know that firsthand for
Yeah,
some
well,
people I've
it's like,
interviewed for some of my books. Yeah.
No.
well, I mentioned Russ Johnson before. I mean, if I had procrastinated by 2 months, I would have missed him.
My
So
I'm
it's
friends
like,
with Mark knows I'm friends with Skip Craig, who is a sound editor on Rocky and Bullwinkle. I call him, or he calls me every month, okay, on the phone just to talk.
yeah,
Today we were on discussion with Al Kilgore's Bullwinkle comic strip, which I think is the best adapted comic strip of a cartoon show ever
yeah.
written. Because it's just exactly like the cartoon in every way.
Kilgore was a fantastic illustrator.
I love him.
Cartoonist.
I
Yeah,
I just posted an artwork I saw online of his of Chaplin and Keaton
yep,
dueling on Facebook. Because they reprinted books of those things. Some anonymous person, unlicensed, did a great reprint of those comic strips. Which I was actually Mark, Jerry, and Curtis Finley's guinea pig, because I bought them before they did. Like, what's quality like?
yeah.
But so
I have them now. And I have the
they're
Sagendorf
good.
Popeye one too. I don't know if there's any
No,
others.
that was you who told me about that one.
Oh, okay.
I did not know about that one, but that's the same guy.
That's true. Yeah. I didn't know the order of things, but I know I got all 3 books. I don't think there's any
You were the
more
one
that
who
I've
informed
seen.
me
Yeah.
about Sagendorf, and I had to inform
Yeah.
Curtis, and then Curtis once again says, "What's the quality?"
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting though is here we're having this Zoom discussion that you guys are recording, and I wish I had that with older collectors that I knew.
Yeah.
I had a
Those
good
is-
friend. I had a good friend, Cy Schechter, who actually worked for famous Studios. He was an
Yeah.
in-between. He was an
Oh
in-betweener.
yeah.
He was an in-betweener on Popeye in the 50s. And he was like, he said, he admitted he was just a schlock artist. All he was doing was tracing animation drawings basically onto celluloid. But he's a guy who had been collecting since the 30s and went to visit Billy DeBeck in his studio in 1935. I have the little drawing up there. I don't know if you can, this way you can't really see it.
Oh wow. Getting the first time look.
This is the drawing that Cy got from Billy DeBeck in 1935 when a 19-year-old Fred Laswell was assisting DeBeck.
Yeah.
And
I
so,
do like Fred stuff too.
yeah, so I just think it's real. I mean, so I have a wealth of knowledge from Cy just because we talk almost every day. He was living in the Bronx, and his tastes went towards jazz and towards blues. And I mean, we talk about politics, we talk about comic strips.
Yeah.
But he was so fully invested in this stuff. But we've lost a lot of those people now. I mean, Art Wood was somebody I talked to quite a bit. He's gone. Walter Lawrence was somebody who taught me a lot about early illustration work. He's gone. So all these older collectors pass away, and we don't have like a repository of their knowledge base. I think it's really important. And on my computer, I've got digitized interviews. I don't know anybody who wants them. I mean, I've
post them online, put them up here. So, hey,
something I could.
yeah, give them to Kamden. There we go.
I'd love to see them be in an archive, though. But the question I've had asked is who owns the copyright to them, and I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I've got, I went to Rick Yeager's house in the late 80s, early 90s to interview him because when Dennis was doing what was the book Dennis was? Oh, he was doing the Russell Keaton book, Sky Roads, and Keaton was an early assistant for Dick Hawkins of Buck Rogers, and so Yeager knew him from there. I mean, he was a hoot and a half. I mean, I go in there, he's playing the piano, he's got a saber-toothed tiger skull on his piano. I mean, he had he'd tell me about Hawkins watercolors of spaceships that they had in the studio, Buck Rogers spaceships that they had dangling from the ceiling. That stuff is just gold, and I I don't know what'll happen to that stuff. My wife won't know where they are on my hard drive.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've got to find a place for that stuff because a lot of what I have now is digitized. I still have a lot of paper, but a lot of then that's what I hope to use the blog in some ways for as well, to be able to host that stuff. Yeah.
Now, without taking it down, I was going to ask you about the stuff on your wall. You don't
Yeah.
have to take it down, but what other goodies do you have on the wall behind you?
I remember that when I interviewed Rob, one of the coolest things you had was were those Schultz pieces you have. You don't have a Schultz. You didn't have a Schultz strip, but you had some other cool Schultz pieces.
Well, I will move my camera. Let me see if I can do this without making you guys seasick.
Oh, okay.
There's a Schultz drawing from the butternut bread
Oh, cool.
ad campaign. I've got a couple. I think I've got three. I've got one of Lucy at her doctor's booth, and I've got one of on the back wall of a pencil prelim of Charlie Brown, and I think I've got two pencil prelims by Schultz, which I really love. We were talking about Patrick McDonald. Is
Mutt's down there, yeah.
a Mutt's Daily. I was from a trade with him. Sorry about the shakiness.
That's okay.
There's a Barney Good, Billy DeBeck signed check with a little drawing of Barney Google on it.
Cool.
That's a lot of money then.
Well, we moved to the there's our man George Harriman. There's a studio photograph of him. So I've got a Harriman corner here. This is a Sunday page there. I think that's 1919. Then I've got two Sunday pages in front of my computer. One from 1917.
More stuff up than I thought.
Yep. Sorry
That's
about
okay.
that.
That's okay.
Yep. And then got a
Marvin
Spiegelman.
keeps directing the camera to you.
Spiegelman. There's a Spiegelman. So I did a trade with Art, and I was very thrilled with what he sent me. And Kamden, I know you don't like this one, but there's a Popeye drawing. So
what is that?
I've got I've got more stuff there, and I've got flat files just filled with stuff. So
what was that Popeye of? Is
that's the other thing I always struggle with is wall space.
This was done for there was a guy named Francis Greeley who must have been somebody, because the collection really featured some really top-notch drawings. I mean, at this point, I think this is about probably around 1933, 34, somewhere around there, just by the style. And at that point, he wasn't sending out drawings to people. He cut a stencil that he would have of like a head and shoulder shot of Popeye. I actually owned the stencil at one point and sold it. That he would have, like, Sagendorf would trace the stencil, and that's what they would send out to fans. So I'll never be able to afford a Thimble Theater Daily again. And so this showed up at auction a few years ago, and I grabbed it because it was pretty affordable, especially compared to what they're worth.
What are those strips over your right shoulder?
Down below.
Yeah, that one was. Yeah,
that's a pogo.
Okay, and then right above it.
That's a bring up father from Jigs in Japan. Okay. And then up top there's a very early Pat Sullivan daily strip before Felix the Cat.
Oh, cool.
So that's I think about a 19.
Is there a name to the strip?
That one was called
sorry.
No, it's all right.
Before Sullivan.
It's on my.
Sullivan actually drew back when Sullivan actually.
Oh yeah, no, that was it was something along the line of like Johnny Boston Beans or something. Okay. It's on my comic art. It's on my comic art. So he assisted Billy Mariner for a while in this before he got into animation and before he got into Felix the Cat. He assisted Billy Mariner, and Billy Mariner drew a strip that was similar to that. And then after Mariner passed away, or maybe Mariner was still alive at that point, he died in a fire. Sullivan drew that strip for a couple of years or so, something like that, not a very long time. I mean, those early days of comic strips, a lot of these guys drew a lot of strips. I mean, Harriman, drew a ton of comic strips, and it wasn't until Crazy Cat that he had that strip for a long time. Even then, he drew.
Yeah, Wizard McKay had like 18 different strips that lasted a week.
Sometimes they just had one-off strips. There might be a one Sunday page. I mean, it was amazing how many some of these guys have. Do you guys have?
I love. That's why I love Alan Holtz's blog.
You have his book.
I do not.
I
Oh
don't.
wow, I do not have his book,
No, I
but I
don't.
love his blog.
It's a little bit expensive, but this is my Bible. Because
How much is it now? Do you think?
Alan, what's that?
How much is it? One.
Well, you know, it's published by University Press. I think it was 75 new. I got a comp copy because I've got a blurb on the back cover because
Hey,
being in academics, that has some weight, I guess.
yeah.
But Alan, the thing about Alan's research is he would
I
not
love his blog. I read his blog every day.
Oh, he's great. He would not include anything unless he had physical proof that it existed.
Yes.
Whether a photocopy or whether a tear sheet, he had to lay eyes on it. So I have found so few mistakes in this, and he'll admit that that's not the be all and end all because more information still has come out. But that's the only book I keep literally on my desk because if I'm looking up something, it's like reach for it and there it is.
Can you show the cover again?
Yep.
So how much you say that 75 new, you said?
At the time it came out, it was 75. I don't know what it is. I mean, if it's still being published by University of Michigan Press, then the price should be about what it was if it's still in print.
Yeah.
And it comes with a CD, but I'll be honest, I've never used the CD, so I just use it for the reference inside. What's nice about it is he'll talk about ghosts if there's evidence of somebody ghosting a strip.
Yeah.
But he's pretty good on start and end dates when he has firm information. But again, you could look up different people. It's like there's a whole list of the strips that they drew, and some of them might have appeared twice or one time. And if he's seen an example, it went in the book. So I don't know what it goes for now, but that's definitely. I mean, if you're interested in the history of the field, to me, it's an invaluable resource. You know, the problem with a book like that for a lot of collectors is there's no pictures. You know, I mean,
I have no problem with that.
The CD has the examples on it, and
Yeah.
I don't need the CD for that. So
Yeah.
I just want it for the information. So
now we have the internet. I can just, if I need the example, I can just look it up online.
Right.
If you can find it on the internet, though, that's the thing. Some of these things you can't even find online.
Yeah, so
that's valid too. But
this is
his blog exists.
This is on Amazon. I'm not saying that you can't find it cheaper, but paperback 150, hardcover 300. So
I wonder though. I wonder if the University Press still has it.
They might. And yeah, I usually recommend doing that, going directly through publishers, because even if they may not say it's in stock, they might have a few spare copies around, you know.
You might even contact Alan himself and see if he's got a copy he wants to sell you.
Yeah, do a trade or something.
Yeah. So I mean, I will tell you that's been one of the nice perks having been in the field so long, is I've helped out on so many books that have gotten a lot of comp copies on stuff. Like
I've noticed that too. I've noticed that being younger than a lot of people will either give me free copies of books, or because they'll just enjoy it. Yeah, you've given me free copies of books before. So is Laura Leibowitz, who writes Jack Benny column, and other people. Or they'll be like, hey, I got this stuff that I don't want. You want it? I'm like, sure. And it'll be like a 1931, 33 Little King bound copy leather book or something.
Right.
That's what somebody sent me. That's what somebody sent me the other day.
I mean, when Chris Ware was editing the Fantagraphics Crazy Cat series, I had some cool Harriman things. I've got a number of photos of Harriman that he didn't have, so I gave them to him, and so I've got the 3 hardcover volumes of the Fantagraphics books, as well as all the paperbacks, and they're expensive now, so they were just nice to get comp copies.
That's why I'm glad that they're reprinting them right now.
Yes. Well, there's not much money in the field, or in this part of the field, as far as I can tell. But
I hope they keep doing them, though.
As long as they can make a buck on them, they will.
Because I've heard that Gary Groth is committed to finish. I've heard that Gary Groth, though, when he starts something at Fantagraphic, he finishes it usually, though.
I don't know Gary very well. I used to work with Kim Thompson. When he was alive, he was my connection there, and I never really worked with Gary directly, so I don't know much.
I've worked with Gary, and I think it's a fair assessment.
Okay.
He does like to carry things through to the end, unless it's somehow impossible, usually contractually or something, that he can't
Right.
continue it beyond a
But
certain.
like, but
Yeah.
like, I know that he's on. I've gotten every volume of Pogo so far, which I love about Pogo. I don't understand Pogo, but I hope. But I'm really gonna miss those R.C. Harvey columns at the end of those Fanographic Pogo books, because that was the way I understood the strip, by reading it. And if I
Yeah.
didn't understand something, I could just go to the back of the book, and there would always
Yep.
be a great explanation. And I was able to follow that strip and love it so well.
Yeah.
Now he's no longer with us, so I hope
Yeah,
they'll do something similar.
Bob's passing was a big loss. And the thing that cracked me up about Bob's writing was, if there's a $3 word instead of a 25-cent word, he would use it. He was a real wordsmith, but
Yeah.
when he went into a subject, I mean, his Kniff book is pretty amazing. I mean, the level of detail in
I
that
checked
book.
that out at the library I worked at. I read it.
Yeah,
Because I worked in a public library. It happened that book happened to be like one of the only biographies of a cartoonist on their shelf, because it's a small library. But I read it and I thought it was really well done.
yeah. No, he was an excellent writer. And again, we're just losing people.
Yeah,
He was involved in the field for a long time,
his
and when
Popeye book,
he was a hell of a cartoonist himself too.
his whoever did that documentary with him, Tom, he was telling me about Bob's Popeye book that's been in the works. That he it's called Popeye, Master of the Medium. I pre-ordered it. It's now I know you're good friends with Fred Grandinetti, Mark, but I think this by far beats Fred's book.
Well, if you listen to my podcast with Fred, I didn't even buy the history of the strip book by Fred. Yeah, and it's and no offense to Fred, and he knows because I told him directly. It's like it seems like more of his personal experiences with Popeye more than a direct history, and so that's fine. It's just not for me. So it's like, but I have his other books on the cartoons because they're great. Because
anyway. I love Fred's Jack Mercer book. That's the book I really like of Fred's.
I had the Mercer book and I had the '60s Popeye. I know you don't.
I have not bought that yet, but I've heard it's really good.
I recommend it. We even both said it in the podcast. It's like it's the most thorough book, so you don't ever have to watch those cartoons again. I think
his Mercer book.
I think the level is here. Most people hate those cartoons. I like them. Fred loves them, so it's like there's your level of anyway.
But it's called Popeye, Master of the Medium. In fact, there's a Comic-Con convention panel on that book.
Yeah.
That Jerry is on, and a lot of other people are on. And it's all about the Fleischer cartoons. Even the radio show has its own chapter, I've heard. But like, it's supposed to be really good, and I've pre-ordered it from Hermes Press.
I'm looking forward to that.
Did you pre-order yet?
Kamden, you mentioned Pogo before. One of the things I find interesting about Pogo is I think the main character is the most boring of the characters in the strip. I mean, I've got 4 or 5 strips. I think Kelly's work is one of the great bargains in comic art because there's so many out there.
Yeah,
I've
seen them. I've seen them in my age for like $100 on eBay before.
Oh, you can find them pretty but I love the bat characters, and I love like the little mouse character and Churchy. I think the secondary characters and the tertiary characters are some of the best characters. The bat characters, the wordplay with them just cracks me up.
My favorite is Albert, just because he almost reminds me of Kelly himself. I know he's kind of like, because he's got the cigar and he's like a mix between Kelly himself, but he's also almost like Groucho in a little bit too. And he's so arrogant. I like him.
Hopefully he didn't drink as much as Kelly did.
Yeah.
Well, in a certain way, it sounds like Pogo's like Charlie Brown and Albert's like Lucy or something. Maybe not exact correlation, but I mean, I know each comic strip artist and writer has aspects of their own personality in every character.
Sure.
It's unavoidable. You have to. It's autobiographical. You said yourself.
In some ways, Schultz's characters hold up though because everyone can relate to them too. Because like I always saw that Charlie Brown was my favorite character because I was bad at sports. I always felt like sometimes feel I had nothing in common with anybody. I would often feel like I'd have no friends, unfortunately, even
Yeah.
though I did, just didn't understand it at the time, right?
Yeah.
But so I also always related to Charlie Brown in a way.
Yeah.
Mm.
I related to Charlie Brown for the same reasons, and then Linus because I have an older sister who, in the past, she's not that way now, but in the past she's a lot like Lucy, and she
Mm.
hated the comparison. It was
She was
true.
a fuss budget, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And so a lot of those iconic like late 60s, early 70s Sunday strips where it's Lucy and Linus just going at each other about the blanket or chocolate milk or
Right.
whatever, it's like those it's almost like Charles Schultz was hiding in my closet writing down
My
things saying
my
this actually
favorite
happened, it's like
my favorite peanut strip that I relate to, and this is me 100%, as you can see by my comic books in the back of my room right here, where I'm looking through my comic books to see which one I haven't read 100 times, and I'm looking, and I got cereal out in the kitchen that's gonna go soggy, and then
oh,
it's
that one, yeah,
back
yeah,
in the
that's
cereal
one of them.
soggy.
Yeah.
That's me. That strip of his, I'm like, this is 100% me. I have been here.
Yeah.
Well, a book I am looking forward to that comes out next month, I believe, is Bill Griffith's book about Ernie Bushmiller, that
Yeah,
three
yeah.
rocks.
It's weird that I
The
never
book,
found Ernie Bushmiller good until I got older, and then I'm like, wait, this is like,
I think everybody does that.
yeah, Bushmiller was the first what I considered adult comic strip I understood as a kid. And I don't know, I just sort of got the gags.
yeah,
But there's something so wonderfully dumb about Bushmiller.
Yeah.
I mentioned the old Sulin conventions. I mean, they used to sit on a table, a stack of dailies for $5 each, and nobody wanted. But I think once Dennis started publishing the Bushmiller books, all of a sudden people really got to see the genius of Bushmiller.
Yeah.
And I read Griffith's the book he wrote about his mother. Um, I can't remember which card was it. Lawrence Larrier she was seeing, a magazine cartoonist. It was brilliant. I mean, he really. I mean, I know a lot of people know him from Zippy, but
I think Jimmy's a very
in
good
terms
strip
of
too.
being a storyteller, he's incredible. And I think this book he's doing, I think, is going to be really something. So
I think Zippy is my favorite current running strip still.
Kamden, have you ever talked to Bill?
I've never talked to Bill. I would
You
love
should.
to.
You should. He's a fun guy. Yeah.
He's
Very knowledgeable. Yeah. And I met him a few times, because he's been at conventions out here on the West Coast. Because I used to live in California, but I'm in Oregon now, so it's like
Okay.
I used to see all these guys in San Francisco and stuff.
Right.
I think
And
the reason why I never also got Nancy though, because the very first Nancy I saw was the guy who came after Nancy.
Kai Gilchrist.
Oh God, I always thought, and even before I knew who he was, I thought like, this is a lousy strip.
Yeah.
Well, there was, I think, Mark Lasky. Was he?
Plus,
No, it was Guy Gilchrist was the guy I'm talking.
No, I know,
Yep.
but Mark Lasky did this. Lansky or Lasky did the strip for a couple years, but he died very young.
Yeah,
and he was kind of faithful. I liked Jerry Scott's version of the strip. It was kind of an animated version. He wasn't trying to be Bushmiller, but he wasn't trying to be too over the top. But yeah, the Gilchrist I wasn't such a fan of.
I think that's one of the reasons why I like Little Abner, the strip. I think the reason why I don't care for it as much as other people do, though, is because I learned more about Al Cap than I should have before actually being able to delve into the strip. I learned about Al Cap more. Well, I learned about Al Cap's life through Brian Walker's book a little bit too, about his anti-communist thing and about his, growing and living in Alabama. You also learn about, his touring of the University of Alabama.
Yep.
So you learn about that before you even read about a week's worth of his strip. His strip is really good, but it's kind of spoiled.
Well, and I will say though, I've never been a big Abner fan. I think it's a beautifully drawn strip that's not very well written, and I've got some of the books and the continuities. Yeah. I feel like wait a minute, and it's gorgeous. I mean, the artwork is gorgeous, but the writing has just sort of left me cold, so I've never cared that much about the strip. And politics aside, I mean, he started off, he was pretty much a lefty in the beginning, and then as time went on, he became more and more, of a right winger. But the strip, I mean, but it's all subjective. I know people who are big fans of the strip.
Yeah.
I think it's largely because of, but you know, um, Bob Harvey and I used to talk about some strips, and he always wanted to do a Comic-Con panel, really talking about the visual and the verbal of strips. And I
Yeah.
think oftentimes art collectors are really looking at the visual, and they're not
Yeah.
really caring. And it's one reason why I have no desire to collect contemporary comic book art, because if it doesn't have the text on it,
Yeah.
I, I don't want an empty. So
Mark
Farrell.
and I have talked for ages about how we don't even care about the contemporary art of comic books.
Well, but I will say, like Farrell Dalrymple, I don't know if you follow Farrell stuff.
Well, we're talking about the superhero guys, really.
Well, Farrell's done some superhero stuff, not much. He's done Omega, but he still hand letters all of his comics. He's kind of an eclectic stylist. I like his work a lot. Um, Tony Sandoval, the Mexican artist who's living in Paris now, or I guess he's in France. He still hand letters his work, and odd sort of stories that I dig. Beautiful watercolors. But to me, I mean, that's what comics is. It's not just pictures, it's that marriage
Yeah.
of the visual and verbal. And I've never understood like having a page that doesn't have anything on it except pictures. I mean, I know you could print overlays and all that stuff, but I don't know. I have no interest in collecting that stuff.
I
I
think
know.
that's what makes Mad so good, though, too. Mark's writing a Mad book,
Yeah.
a book about Mad Magazine, and I love Mad Magazine, particularly in its first 2 decades. But because it's not really just because of the art, and they had great artists, but it's really because of what they were saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have a writing background, and I think it stemmed from my dad, because you were mentioning Lil Abner. Lil Abner was one of my dad's favorite strips growing up. He's still around. He's 85, but he noticed that it was kind of like certain soap operas, that there was, you're talking about the pacing on some adventure strips, some little Abner concepts just went on and on and on. And
Yeah.
it's like, all right, we got the joke here. And it'd just be more and more and more. Or
Yeah.
it would be the same joke just a year later, Sadie Hawkins
Right.
Day, again and again
Right.
and again and again. And it's like, I'm sure that they were all little shortcuts, because he had to churn out so much material, but it just kind of hurt my dad's interest in the strip over the long haul, because he likes good writing more than I've gone on record, that since we mentioned animation, that the greatest animated series ever is Rocky and Bullwinkle.
Yes.
And it probably has the worst animation ever. And and that's how much I like good writing. So it has to be the marriage of the two. I agree.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that because my son used to love the Nick Parks claymation
I like those.
pieces. Yeah, I mean the Wallace and Gromit, but even he did that. He did a series of shorts. I think it was pre Wallace and Gromit, and they were kind of for kids, but maybe more for adults.
He did
Like
Shaun the Sheep, and
no, it's before
earlier
the
he did
Wallace.
penny cartoons that were on Pee-wee's Playhouse.
Well,
But
he did something about um it was almost like set as a documentary about these animals
oh,
who were in.
yeah, what's that
You know
called?
what I'm talking about. But
Yeah,
then he did the one with the auntie.
Creature Comforts. Creature Comforts.
Yes, the one with the girl's aunt who
Yeah,
who dies, but she comes back because she's forgotten her handbag, and she has this whole conversation with the devil. And we were looking at this stuff, going, "This is just so effing weird," but it's brilliant. I mean, the writing, it was not for kids,
no,
but on some level, it was for kids as well. But yeah, I mean, the Little Abner thing's interesting because again, it's all context for me. For whatever reason, there was a hillbilly craze in this country at that time, and I don't know. I don't know if part of it was, photographers who were documenting Appalachia at the time during the WWPA, but you had, Barney Google all of a sudden, goes into Appalachia and finds Snuffy Smith. You've got Little Abner. I mean, all this is happening at the same time, and stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. We look at it, 100 years later, 80 years later, it's like, okay, well, this is bad or this is good, but for some reason, public became fascinated by stuff at
I mean,
this time.
like Disney was even doing like stuff like Make Mine Music,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, and
Oh, the
so
Martins and McCoys, that type of thing. Yeah.
yeah,
So, yeah.
Well, what year did The Grapes of Wrath come out?
41, I believe.
Okay, so
Now,
that would have been
my dad lived it, actually. He was born in Oklahoma.
right.
He didn't live there very long, but the Dust Bowl was going on. So,
Yep.
and then he was born in 38. So, and then came out to California. They lived in Riverside, Bakersfield, and everything. And then when his brother was born in 41, they went back to Oklahoma because some of the family was still there, and then came out.
Yeah, I'm also trying to think of a movie maybe that is more.
A lot of those Steinbeck novels are like that. Cannery Row,
Yeah, but
Mice and Men, all
Mice
that
and Men's
stuff.
the only one I've read. So
I'm even thinking about Gary Cooper and Sergeant York, which I think
read
took
more
place in
read more Steinbeck, Camden. It's
yeah, it
good.
took place in Tennessee. And so I guess in context again, there's not a lot of movies about Appalachia at the time. There's no internet about Appalachia. There's no, life pictorials about Appalachia. So these cartoonists are sort of introducing,
Yeah,
the rest of the country to this slice of the world.
but they do kind of touch on it in movies and TV. They had Ma and Pa Kettle movies, and later
Yeah,
Beverly Hillbillies and Andy Griffith and all that stuff. And
yeah, but that was
maybe
much
rather
later
than
though.
the
Yeah.
Ozarks, though, is like because I've heard people debate whether or not Andy Griffith was a hillbilly show.
I don't
well,
think it was a
maybe
hillbilly show. I think it was just a small town.
yeah,
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I don't know.
I think it's
Yes,
rural is the right
rural
term
show.
for it.
Okay,
yes, yeah. I'd say
yeah,
rural would
okay,
be correct.
true hillbilly. Yeah, you're right.
I mean,
But
I always thought of it as a more southern show. I mean,
yeah,
living in the Midwest now since '89,
yeah,
I wouldn't picture it in
all,
Wisconsin, say, but I
Yeah,
yeah.
don't.
that's it. I would, as someone who grew up in Baton Rouge and Birmingham, Alabama, and where I live now, I wouldn't picture it here either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although on
So
Andy Griffith, if you go earlier, like his stand-up comedy, he's playing more country bumpkin there. So
oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
so
yeah,
his No Time for Sergeants was brilliant, I
yeah,
thought.
yeah.
But I understand he was not the nicest of people to work with during that time, which is kind of sad compared to his character, which was,
right.
a pretty wholesome sort of character. But that has nothing to do with comic strips or comic art.
Well, we're on a tangent. We've been talking for a long time, so we should probably wrap it up. But I'm
Yep.
just kind of curious. Uh, any books in the planning for you, or any? You
Yeah.
mentioned
Have you ever thought
possible
about writing a book,
article.
Rob?
You mentioned more articles for Hogan's Alley. So, what's
Well,
coming up for you now that you're retired?
what's coming up for me? That's a good question. I get asked that a lot now that I'm retired. What's coming up for me is let me see. Go to the shelves. My did I pull off the wrong? I pulled off the wrong thing. Sorry. I have my Malden shelf here.
Got the brass ring over there.
So the next thing.
Everybody has the brass ring.
No, I've got better than the brass ring. So I
But that's
have.
but if anybody has a Malden book, that's the book they have is the brass ring. There we go.
So this was a book he self-published when he was in Sicily.
Yeah.
It's a pretty scarce book. I think I've got 5 copies of it. And for some reason, this book resonated with soldiers who used them as like yearbooks. And so they would pass them through the divisions. And so, I've got all these copies, and I have transcribed um, who's on what page, where they're from. Actually, I found somebody in here I found 2 soldiers from Wisconsin, one from Madison who was killed in action, and one who was about 40 minutes north of me, 35 minutes north of me in Wausau, and his daughter is still up there. And so I sent her a picture, I found her on Facebook, sent her a picture of the page her father had signed, and she gave me some background on the stuff. So, I've brought these in when I taught my my sort of art appreciation class. I've got a whole bunch of them.
Oh,
I would hand them out to students and talk about them as historic documents and just kind of remind them that, some of the guys who signed these didn't make it home. And some of the guys who signed these were your age and didn't make it home. So my next thing that I need to do, I don't know if it'll happen this summer or not, but I've got a web domain registered. I think it's billmaldenart.com. I will it'll be sort of a blog type page again, sort of similar to the formats I'm doing now, but I'm going to feature each one of the books and picture each of the pages and then list who's on what page, because it's my hope that family members might run across these. They might do a search for their father, grandfather, great grandfather or something, and might be able to see where they were, when they were stationed in Sicily or in southern France at that time. So that's kind of a passion project for me, because I just stumbled across these one time, and most people would look at this and be like, who the hell wants a book with writing on the cover? And I
Mhm.
looked at it as, holy cow, I mean, all these guys all in one place at
right.
that one time. And I've done some research on some of them. Most of them made it home, thankfully. Some of them didn't. And then, one guy's buried in the same graveyard in Rome where Gregor Duncan's buried. I'd like to be able to head there someday and pay my respects to Gregor Duncan, since I've done so much writing about him, and stop and pay my respects to this guy's grave as well. So that's the next thing. Books, I doubt it. I mean, I actually wouldn't mind writing a book about drawing. I mean, I've taught drawing for so many decades now, and I've got my own approaches to teaching drawing that that's something I wouldn't mind considering, but it's too much work right now. I've only been retired for like 3 months now, and I'd still like to teach them too. I'd still like to teach like a class a year or so,
Oh, okay. So,
because teaching's always the easiest part. It's not, the bureaucracy. Really, it's the bureaucracy is why I retired. I just
I
got
have
tired.
one question for you though, Rob, before you
Yeah.
go.
Yep.
So we were originally going to do this on Saturday, but you had an auction you wanted to attend.
Yes.
Did you win anything?
Yes, I did. I don't have them with me, of course. The auction was in Australia, which the internet, I mean, so I was on last night at 7. It was today, 10 in the morning for them. And so that's why, but I collect, I love this Ginger Meg's character was an Australian comic strip. Jimmy Banks was a fantastic cartoonist, and outside of Australia, he's not very well known. And so I've collected these annuals for a number of years, and you can't find them very easily in the States.
Yeah.
I found one piece of original art by him in Cleveland on eBay many years ago, and I found a few of them in the States, but the auction last night, there was a lot of 5 of them, including the very first one, which I've never seen before. And I don't care about condition as long as they're complete and aren't colored in. I mean, if covers are detached, I don't care about that stuff, because I want them for reference. So Banks will be a future blog, post. I've got a lot of material by him, but I wanted, I saw these and couldn't resist them. So yes, I did win them. I was bound and determined. Luckily, the US dollar is a lot stronger than the Australian dollar. So that certainly helped. I mean, those are things you have to take into consideration. Shipping from Australia is not cheap. That's got to enter into the final calculation.
yeah,
But part of it is when you've been collecting a long time, sometimes when you see something you've never seen before,
Yeah.
that's the time you have to pick it up.
yeah.
And like I said,
I, I've,
I've been
I've been
collecting
there.
I've been collecting these annuals for about a decade now, and I've never seen the first one for
I,
sale before. And I
quick
thought,
question. Do you ever find something that you've never seen before? And then you find yourself like only because you just bought it, you find it like weeks later or months later.
I don't, you
I've done
know,
that.
yeah, I mean, maybe it's happened some, but
That's me.
not very often.
It
Not all that often, but
happens less often now because yeah, you have so many outlets to find things. But
you know what? There's still
It's
so much
Murphy's
stuff.
Law kind of thing.
yeah,
There's so much stuff that goes under the radar these days. I mean, if it's not a character in spandex,
yeah,
that's like 90% of the collectors who aren't going to care.
yeah.
And so,
And that's when
and
I
you
come in.
Well, that's where
Me too.
that's when I come in. Yeah,
Take
I
my
mean,
money.
I mean, I can't afford to play in that
Yeah,
area anyway. I
yeah,
mean, I'm not spending $5,000 for a Sal Buscema Defenders
yeah.
page when I could have had it for $15, 40 years ago, and I didn't want it for $15.
Yeah.
Because quite frankly, a lot of the comic book art's not very good, in my most humble opinion.
But we're gonna
I think it,
we've talked about this a long time. Mark and I have the same feeling about comic books. Is I always loved comic book artists back when they all considered themselves cartoonists in a way.
hmm,
Like people like Siegel and Schuster and Kirby and all Kirby, Siegel and Schuster and Bill Finger. They all labeled themselves as like great adventure artists, great
hmm.
adventure cartoonists in some ways.
Well, also
I
that
really
they,
like their art more than like an artist who like you frown upon the idea of calling yourself a cartoonist when you're drawing two men in spandex is running around, two men in tights
Yeah,
running around.
when I was a kid though, I loved the Marvel Westerns. I love, Kid Cult Outlaw and Two Gun Kid and Rawhide Kid. I love that stuff. Um, Jack Keller drew most of the Kid Cult Outlaws. He was not a good he was not a good artist. His figures were very stiff. He just was kind of an awkward artist.
Mhm.
But I love that stuff for nostalgic reasons. I don't have a desire to own it.
hmm,
I've got some of them. I've got some of those black and white softcover Marvel reprints. Um, as a kid, I love that stuff. As an adult, it's like I love Gene Colan's work, but I can't look at a page and not find the flaws because his anatomy was often not very good. And as somebody who's done a lot of figure drawing and taught a lot of figure drawing, I can't once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so, there's certain things I love reading. I love his Daredevil stuff. I love his Nathaniel Dusk stuff. I think he was an incredible tonal artist, but I don't have a desire to own anything by him because I see the flaws, and it's
And
the
it
same
costs too
thing.
much.
What's that?
All the Marvel and DC stuff probably cost too
yeah,
much too.
yeah, too pricey.
Well, it costs too much, but to me, it's not worth it
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I could buy strips that I really like for a fraction, and
Yeah.
I enjoy them a lot more. So, at some point, I guess some point along the way, I learned to separate the nostalgia part from,
yeah.
from the, so I did. I think you mentioned, Camden, you saw the post I did on Alex Toth on my blog.
Yeah. I
Uh,
share that with some Hanna-Barbera buffs that were really
yeah.
I
So
never cared for the Hanna-Barbera superheroes except action shows, except Johnny Quest, Mark and I.
right, but
But I love that post you did, and my friends also liked it.
But so I probably have, I bet you I have 25 of his sketch pages. He probably sent me a dozen of them from our years of correspondence. You could still go on Anthony Snyder's site or Mitch Itkowitz's site, and you could buy those pages for $70, $100,
Yeah.
$150. But most collectors don't care about that stuff because they're sketches, they're preliminary. Where if you want to buy a published page by Toth, you're spending thousands these
Yeah.
days.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
To me, I look at those, I'm like, these are incredible. I mean, I love he would get on these kind of riffs of narration in them, or he'd start playing around with planes or cars, and he liked those old Stanley steamers that he would play with. I mean, he just was always kind of riffing on different things on those sketch pages. But most collectors, they want the finished thing or they want the published thing, and I don't look at it that way. It's like if I like it, and
Yeah.
there's something you're seeing some spark there that's good enough for me. So they just happen to be cheaper too, because most collectors don't want them.
That's what I said about my What's Opera doc. I'm like, Mom, Dad, it doesn't have to look pretty. I just like it. It's just it's a production thing.
I like it. I like it. Anyway.
So that's me. That was me.
Anyway, last question, and then
Yep.
we'll wrap it up. Rob, how can people get in contact with you if they want to ask you a question or offer you some free comic
Through
strips?
any of my many websites or on Facebook. Yeah, I mean, robstolzer.com is the easiest email address, and I've got I don't use contact forms on the websites, but my email's listed on any of the websites. So if they just Google me or DuckDuckGo me or whatever search engine, Bing me, whatever search engine you're
Search Hippo.
using. Yes, they can find me even through my
Alta
university
Vista.
email. Yeah,
Anyway,
yep.
all right.
So no, I'm pretty easy to find. I mean, I've been out of the witness protection program for years now, so I'm available.
All right. Well, I want to wrap it up here. I want to thank you, Rob Stolzer and Kamden Spies, for being my guests today. It was a wonderful conversation. All about comic strips and animation and whatever came up, a
Yep,
little Abner, whatever, All right.
I
And
enjoyed it, guys. Thanks very much.
thank you very much. And we'll see you next time on the next Fun Ideas podcast.
Take care, guys.